Folks, buckle up, because today we're diving headfirst into the economic dumpster fire that is the Bank of England's budget crunch. Yes, the very institution tasked with saving Britain from financial ruin is now crying broke, pointing fingers, and begging for scraps. And guess what? It's all your fault. Well, not really, but you can bet the government will spin it that way. Stick around as we rip apart this mess, expose the incompetence, and show you how the powers that be have turned the guardian of Britain's economy into a glorified IT repair shop. Let's get started. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Boss Economics World, the only place where we call out economic nonsense with zero apologies and maximum facts. Today, we're tackling a story that's hotter than a British heatwave in June 2025, yep, I'm talking about the Bank of England's, BOE, so-called, budget crunch. According to the latest reports, the BOE is in financial dire straits, scrambling to fix its crumbling IT systems, hire more staff, and overhaul its forecasting models after getting a verbal spanking from none other than former Fed Chair Ben Bernanke. But here's the kicker, they're doing all this while shelving non-essential projects and begging the Treasury for more cash. Sounds like a central bank in crisis, right? Wrong. This is a crisis of government mismanagement, a textbook case of underfunding, incompetence, and priorities so skewed you'd think they were drawn up by a toddler with a crayon. Now, before we dive into the juicy details, let's set the stage. The BOE, for centuries, has been the bedrock of Britain's financial stability, or so they'd like you to believe. But in recent years, it's been criticized for everything from failing to tame double-digit inflation to being woefully unprepared for the stickiness of price pressures. And now, in 2025, we learn they're facing a funding squeeze so tight they can't even afford to keep the lights on without cutting corners. So, what's really going on here? Is this just a central bank struggling to modernize, or is it the latest chapter in the UK government's long saga of economic mismanagement? Spoiler alert, it's the latter, and we've got the data, the examples, and the receipts to prove it. Let's start with the most glaring issue, the BOE's IT infrastructure, or as I like to call it, the digital equivalent of a Victorian-era steam engine. According to insiders, the central bank is pouring money into fixing its dilapidated IT systems after years of underinvestment. And when I say years, I mean it. Bernanke's 2024 review found a material degree of underinvestment in the BOE's tech, a problem so bad it's practically a national security risk. Think about it. This is the institution responsible for setting interest rates, managing inflation, and overseeing the stability of the entire UK financial system, and they're running on software that probably still thinks Y2K is a looming threat. Now, let's put this in perspective. The BOE's latest accounts show operating expenses of nearly £800 million, $1.1 billion, in the year through February 2024, with a significant chunk of that now being funneled into IT repairs. Governor Andrew Bailey has boasted about a £30 million investment in cloud computing and data systems, but let's be real, £30 million is a drop in the bucket when you're trying to drag a 300-year-old institution into the 21st century. For comparison, the US Federal Reserve spent $1.6 billion on IT in 2023 alone, according to their annual report, and they're not exactly starting from scratch like the BOE is. But here's where the government comes in. The BOE doesn't just get to print money for itself, its budget is set by the Treasury and funded partly through the BOE levy, a tax on banks and building societies. And guess what? The Treasury has to approve any increase in that levy. So, while the BOE is begging for cash to fix its tech, the government is sitting on its hands, pretending this isn't a problem of their own making. And don't even get me started on the irony of a government that's obsessed with digital transformation, hello, NHS digitization fiasco, but can't be bothered to fund the central bank's tech upgrades. It's like giving a firefighter a garden hose to put out a forest fire and then blaming them when the forest burns down. Next up, let's talk about the BOE's forecasting models, or as I like to call them, the economic equivalent of a magic 8-ball. Ben Bernanke's 2024 review didn't mince words, the BOE's forecasting infrastructure is in urgent need of an upgrade. This comes after the bank was lambasted for failing to predict the persistence of double-digit inflation in 2023, a failure that left ordinary Brits grappling with skyrocketing prices for everything from groceries to energy bills. And let's not forget, Bernanke noted that the BOE's forecasting errors were in line with other central banks, which is basically the economic equivalent of saying, hey, everyone else is failing too, so it's fine. Spoiler alert, it's not fine. Here's the kicker, fixing this mess requires not just new tech but also more staff. Insiders say the BOE needs to hire scores of new employees to overhaul its forecasting and communication processes. But with the budget crunch, where's the money coming from? Oh, right, they're shelving non-essential investments to pay for it. Translation, the BOE is robbing Peter to pay Paul, all because the government has refused to properly fund the institution responsible for steering the UK economy. And let's talk numbers. According to the Office for National Statistics, ONS, UK inflation peaked at 11.1% in October 2022, the highest in 41 years, and while it's come down to 3.2% by May 2025, it's still above the BOE's 2% target. Meanwhile, real wages, adjusted for inflation, have fallen by 2.8% since 2021, per the Resolution Foundation. This is the human cost of the BOE's forecasting failures, and it's a direct result of government underfunding and mismanagement. If the BOE had the resources to modernize its models a decade ago, maybe we wouldn't be in this mess. But no, successive governments have treated the central bank like a piggy bank they can raid whenever they need to fund their latest pet project, looking at you, HS2, which is now projected to cost £66 billion, according to the National Audit Office. Now, let's pivot to the BOE's latest shiny object, the digital pound. Yes, folks, while the central bank is struggling to pay for basic IT upgrades, it's also under pressure to build a central bank digital currency, CBDC, if the government gives the green light. This is the economic equivalent of trying to build a spaceship while your house is on fire. Sure, a digital pound might be the future. China's digital yuan is already in circulation, with transactions totaling 1.8 trillion yuan, $250 billion, by mid-2024, according to the People's Bank of China, but let's get our priorities straight. The BOE's operating expenses jumped by 14%, £38 million, in 2024, partly due to inflation and higher investment, and now they're being asked to fund a project that could cost hundreds of millions, if not billions, down the line. Here's the rub, the government loves to talk up innovation and modernization, but when it comes to footing the bill, they're nowhere to be found. The BOE is already stretching its budget to the breaking point, with non-executive director Ron Califa warning in October 2024 that the investment budget is insufficient, per the minutes of the BOE's Court of Directors. And yet, the government is pushing the digital pound as a priority, all while refusing to increase the BOE levy or provide additional funding. It's classic political posturing, take credit for the shiny new toy, but leave the central bank to clean up the mess. And let's not forget the people caught in the middle of this mess, the BOE's staff. According to insiders, the bank is under pressure to increase wages to attract talent in a competitive job market, but with costs needing to be kept in line with inflation over the next 3 years, per Chief Financial Officer Afwa Kai, pay rises are at risk. This is a recipe for disaster. Underpaid, overworked staff are already stretched thin, with rate setter Swati Dhingra complaining in her annual report that she was understaffed for extended periods during her first term. Here's a fun fact. The UK's financial services sector saw a 4.7% increase in average wages in 2024, according to the ONS, as firms competed for top talent. Meanwhile, the BOE is stuck in a funding straitjacket, unable to match those increases without cutting corners elsewhere. This isn't just a problem for the BOE's employees, it's a problem for all of us. An understaffed, underfunded central bank is less equipped to handle the next economic crisis, whether it's another inflationary spike, a recession, or a financial meltdown. And guess who'll pay the price? You, me, and every other taxpayer in the UK. Now, let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture. The BOE's budget crunch isn't just a central bank problem, it's a government problem. For years, successive UK administrations have treated the BOE like a cash cow, raiding its budget to fund political priorities while failing to invest in the infrastructure needed to keep the economy on track. The BOE hasn't paid a dividend to the government for 5 years, a sign of just how strained its finances are, and yet the Treasury refuses to increase the BOE levy or provide additional funding. This is the same government that's poured billions into failed projects like HS2 and the Test and Trace program, which cost £37 billion with little to show for it, according to the Public Accounts Committee. And let's not forget the broader economic context. The UK economy is still reeling from the aftermath of Brexit, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the energy crisis, with GDP growth projected at a measly 0.6% in 2025, per the International Monetary Fund, IMF. Meanwhile, public debt stands at 98.3% of GDP, according to the ONS, leaving little room for fiscal maneuverability. In this environment, the government's refusal to properly fund the BOE isn't just short-sighted, it's downright reckless. So, what's the takeaway, folks? The Bank of England's budget crunch is a symptom of a deeper disease, government mismanagement, underfunding, and a chronic inability to prioritize. While the BOE scrambles to fix its IT systems, overhaul its forecasting models, and prepare for a digital pound, the government is sitting on the sidelines, pointing fingers and refusing to take responsibility. This isn't just a central bank crisis, it's a national crisis, and it's time for ordinary Brits, financial professionals, and anyone who cares about the economy to demand better. Here's what needs to happen. First, the Treasury must increase the BOE levy and provide additional funding to ensure the central bank can modernize without cutting corners. Second, the government needs to get its priorities straight, stop wasting billions on vanity projects and start investing in the institutions that actually keep the economy afloat. And third, we need accountability. The BOE's failures are inexcusable, but they're not happening in a vacuum. The government's fingerprints are all over this mess, and it's time they owned up to it. So, what do you think, folks? Are you ready to call out this nonsense and demand real change? Drop your thoughts in the comments, smash that like button, and subscribe to Boss Economics World for more no-holds-barred economic commentary. Until next time, keep your wallets close and your skepticism closer. This is Boss Economics World, signing off.